They thought distance would dissolve the imprint, but instead, your silence built a shrine. In trying to erase your presence, they only made it harder to forget. Strangely, it was your exit, not your voice, that echoed louder than anything you ever said. They can't stop replaying your absence like a puzzle they can't solve, haunted not by what you did, but by what you didn't say. What looked like retreat was actually reconfiguration, like a frequency shift they weren't wired to receive. Every step backward wasn't loss, but a recalibration of power they mistook for vanishing. While they celebrated your silence as a victory, you were slipping through dimensions they couldn't measure, crafting a reality they'll only ever witness from a distance. 3 fault lines cracked at once, but none of them noticed until it was too late. The professional circle couldn't stand the mirror you held up, the way your presence triggered quiet storms of inadequacy they had no language for. The friend wearing loyalty like costume jewelry chipped at your momentum with compliments carved from envy, thinking you'd slow down if they kept adjusting your mirror. And beneath them both, the one who once called your name like a promise now feeds off the version of you they think still exists in old stories, unable to grasp you've already rewritten the ending without their permission. Sometimes transformation doesn't shout. Sometimes it disappears. There comes a point where comfort becomes corrosive, where staying begins to chip away at the very essence of who someone was becoming. What once felt safe starts to feel strangely suffocating. It's not just discomfort, it's the quiet rebellion of the soul refusing to remain in a space that no longer reflects its truth. The shifts begin subtly, a heaviness in routines once cherished, a strange resistance to familiar faces, a dull ache in conversations that used to light something up. These aren't coincidences. They're early warnings encoded into the body, subtle alarms sent by a force that sees the long-term consequences before the mind does. Departure isn't always a reaction to chaos. Sometimes it's an answer to an invisible invitation, one only the spirit can hear. The breakdowns in trust, the strange tension in rooms where laughter used to live, the unease that creeps in when someone enters, all are scattered clues pointing toward a decision that will later feel like prophecy. People often mistake collapse for misfortune. But what's actually falling apart is the illusion that this chapter could sustain the next version of you. Not everyone is equipped to witness transformation up close. Some rely on the stillness of others to avoid confronting their own stagnation. They don't resent the light itself, they resent what the light reveals in them. When expansion walks into a room, insecurity starts rearranging the furniture, scrambling to reclaim a sense of superiority that was never theirs to begin with. Growth doesn't humiliate others, it simply removes the excuses they've been hiding behind. Power dynamics begin to fray when authenticity enters sterile environments. A leader who thrives on hierarchy begins to feel their grip slipping as someone steps in with no agenda but truth. They notice how others start to respond differently, not out of fear, but out of resonance. Control becomes ineffective when inspiration takes root. And those who've built their worth on domination start to panic as influence quietly shifts to someone whose presence demands nothing but offers everything. Elsewhere, in the realm of friendship, the unraveling takes on a quieter tone. One person begins to notice how their once admired voice now feels more like background noise. Their suggestions land differently, their guidance no longer held as gospel. It's not hostility. It's the soft erosion of authority that happens when someone you thought would follow forever starts writing their own map. And as shared circles begin to orbit in new directions, those who once stood at the center feel the slow isolation of no longer being needed to navigate the way. There are people who cannot admit they lost you because of who they were, so they reshape the past into a story that flatters their ego. Instead of facing the mirror, they point the lens at you. They tell themselves you left because you weren't ready for something lasting, that you abandoned something sacred out of immaturity or fear. That fiction becomes their shield, deflecting from the truth that they couldn't meet you where you were growing, and had no intention of rising to the level your spirit demanded. But stories built on denial can't survive time. Growth has a way of unraveling delusion. As you evolve, as your presence sharpens and expands, the contradiction becomes visible. You weren't running from depth, you were stepping away from constraint. What once looked like abandonment now looks like liberation. Their tale, once convincing to others, begins to collapse under the weight of your unfolding. Absence does something that presence cannot. It distills essence. And when someone loses access to the energy they once took for granted, their attempts to erase it only magnify its importance. Without intending to, they transform you into something mythic, a name they cannot mention without stirring something unsettled in the room. The more they deny your relevance, the more obvious it becomes that it never left. Behind the scenes, the universe weaves a much bigger plot, one far more precise than any individual can imagine. Those who try to distort your character slowly unravel their own. Without any need for confrontation, their behavior begins to draw its own outlines. The places where your presence once carried things now begin to wobble in your absence. Systems falter. Leadership crumbles. In their scramble to retain power, they broadcast their own flaws louder than you ever could. And then come the public missteps. The mask slips in broad daylight. That quiet undermining during a team presentation is met with someone higher up praising the very idea they tried to discredit. What was meant to humiliate ends up spotlighting brilliance. In another circle, a moment that should have been filled with joy is hijacked by passive jabs wrapped in fake concern. But the room hears the bitterness for what it is. Eyes exchange wordless truths. No one needs to say it aloud. Jealousy always announces itself. Some breakups end quietly, others explode in silence. What happens after yours is the kind of unraveling no one sees coming. They can't process how someone they assumed would stay tethered to their orbit has managed to build a new atmosphere. So instead of confronting their reflection, they begin reworking the story, crafting tales that tilt sympathy in their favor. They edit the timeline, bend emotions into evidence, and play the role of the one who tried too hard for someone who simply couldn't handle real love. But the script doesn't hold up for long. What begins as casual name-dropping mutates into fixation. Conversations you're not part of somehow spiral back to your decisions, your progress, your current path. Their need to remain attached to your story reveals itself in how often your name finds its way into rooms you've never entered. Their updates come wrapped in commentary about your downfall, their joy stitched to predictions of your collapse. But the more they talk, the clearer it becomes, this isn't closure. It's dependency wearing a mask of superiority. Meanwhile, you've gone quiet for reasons they can't decipher. Not out of defeat, but because real transformation requires silence. There's a season where the old identity must disassemble so that something deeper can take its place. You retreat, not to disappear, but to rebuild without spectators. It's a process that doesn't seek attention, it seeks alignment. While they're narrating your story to anyone who'll listen, you're authoring a version they'll never recognize until it's too late. And then, almost imperceptibly, their world starts to fray. The very stability they claimed you disrupted begins to crack in your absence. Tensions rise in the spaces you used to diffuse without trying. Conversations sour. Dynamics shift. The emotional equilibrium you provided, unacknowledged but essential, is gone, and the void begins pulling everything downward. They chalk it up to bad timing, bad luck, or other people's failings, anything but the truth. What they never anticipated is that your energy wasn't an accessory to their life. It was the structure quietly holding chaos at bay. And now that it's gone, the spiral they blamed on you begins accelerating in real time, leaving only one undeniable thread behind it all. Your absence isn't the wound. It was the bandage. Some people only realize what you carried after the structure starts leaning without you. The systems you helped hold together, quietly, without recognition, begin to tremble in your absence. Meetings run longer, decisions come slower, and the once smooth rhythm of productivity becomes disjointed. Where conflict once resolved itself through unspoken harmony, now tension clings to the air. Those in charge, too proud to admit what was lost, begin privately wondering why the spark has gone dim. No one says your name, but the silence around it grows heavy. Elsewhere, in rooms that once overflowed with laughter, something begins to feel missing. The friend who assumed your presence was optional now finds themselves organizing lifeless events that feel more like obligation than celebration. People stop showing up, or worse, they show up and leave early. Jokes fall flat. Conversations repeat. They try to compensate with louder music, trendier venues, and new faces, but nothing lands. They can't manufacture what you used to bring for free, warmth that turned gatherings into memories. In a different corner of the story, someone scrolls through profiles looking for a spark they didn't realize you created. They used to believe they were the reason the connection was electric, until they meet others who don't light up around them. The comparisons creep in slowly. The laughter isn't as real, the silences feel awkward, the attention feels earned instead of offered. What they thought was mutual magic begins to look more like a mirror, one that only reflected back what you were shining all along. Their self-image begins to thin. Compliments don't land the same. Conversations don't flow the same. Attempts to recapture the energy fall flat, and the illusion that they were the center of the glow starts dissolving. It's a rude awakening, not just to the loss of a person, but to the realization that their charm was never self-sustained. It was amplified through proximity to someone who made ordinary things feel unforgettable. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth begins to form in their mind, not through words, but through the growing absence of what used to feel effortless. You were not the problem. You were the reason anything functioned at all. And now, without the current that once powered everything, they are left trying to restart a system that only ever worked because you were in it. Some people don't realize how deeply you rewired the space until you're no longer in it. And then, slowly, like smoke that never fully clears, your memory clings to the corners of their lives. Those who once dismissed you now find themselves in conversations they didn't intend to start, mentioning your name without understanding why it keeps slipping through. That's the signature of someone whose influence moves beyond surface, whose essence alters the rhythm of a room long after their voice goes quiet. The awkward repetition of your name in circles that once rejected your truth isn't a coincidence, it's evidence. Every unnecessary comment, every lingering critique, every curious question betrays their inability to fully let go. Not because of unfinished business, but because your presence destabilized a script they built around control. They now try to rewrite history, yet every retelling reveals more about their internal unrest than about your character. They imitate what they can't replace. Those left behind begin recycling your tone, your cadence, your way of bringing clarity into chaos, without understanding the source of it. But what they replicate lacks the spark that made it alive in the first place. The former authority figure who tried to silence your brilliance now parrots your vision, awkwardly applying strategies without knowing how they worked. The outcomes fall flat. Something vital is missing. And though no one says it out loud, everyone feels the shift. Meanwhile, in quieter social settings, echoes of your influence ripple through casual remarks. Old acquaintances begin remembering moments that only made sense when you were there. Energy that once pulled people together now seems fractured. Questions begin to surface, not out of gossip, but curiosity. Why did you really leave? How could someone that grounded, that consistent, suddenly vanish from view? The old explanations no longer satisfy. As the myth dissolves, the reality emerges. It wasn't your absence that fractured things, it was your presence that held them together. And in that realization, the ones who tried to erase you end up doing the opposite. They become the unexpected storytellers of your legend, replaying your impact in slow, reluctant confessions, never quite able to forget the way everything felt different when you were near. Not every breakthrough happens in the spotlight. In the stillness they misinterpret as defeat, something irreversible begins unfolding. While others chase recognition and play invisible games of control, something far quieter, but far more real, takes shape in your world. The rules they follow no longer apply to you. The momentum they try to manufacture, you receive through alignment. And the resistance they keep wrestling with never even enters your field. Their methods rely on pushing, convincing, strategizing. But none of that translates into results anymore. Not for them. Because while they burn energy trying to bend reality through ego, the path ahead of you clears itself with barely a whisper. You're not forcing anything. You're simply responding to currents they don't feel, signals they don't understand, doors they don't even realize exist. What they view as coincidence is actually precision. And while they fixate on what you've lost, they miss what you're being prepared to receive. Behind closed doors, the seemingly random skills you sharpen in solitude become the exact puzzle pieces someone else has been missing. The connections that find you now aren't built on neediness or convenience, but recognition. They aren't asking you to shrink so they can shine. They're drawn to the very magnitude others once tried to silence. What used to cost you relationships now becomes the reason new ones appear. Stronger, clearer, and finally able to match the depth you carry. The flow of resources shifts too. Not because you change who you are to gain them, but because you stop offering your energy to spaces that never valued it. What used to feel blocked suddenly feels effortless. Where scarcity once echoed, now there's movement. Now there's overflow. And the abundance you once begged for starts arriving, not as a prize, but as a natural response to living in truth. More than anything, you begin feeling something you almost forgot was real, connection that doesn't exhaust you, dialogue that leaves you fuller, not fragmented, support that doesn't feel like a transaction. For the first time in what feels like forever, your value is not just tolerated, it's reflected back with clarity. You're not being reshaped to fit in. You're being honored, finally, for who you've always been. There comes a point in the journey when everything shifts, not because circumstances suddenly become easier, but because your perception no longer aligns with the old script. You're no longer reacting from wounds or trying to prove your worth to systems built to misunderstand you. What once seemed like walls are now irrelevant scenery in the background of a path you've quietly outgrown. The noise that used to pull you into battle now feels too small to answer. Not out of pride, but clarity. Emergence isn't about return. It's about replacement. The outdated identity falls away, and something too expansive for your former life steps forward. What they mistook for your silence was actually reconfiguration. And now, you navigate from a position that doesn't need permission or performance. You move with clean intent, and that changes everything. The positions you once fought for now feel laughably out of sync. Where others used negotiation, you now use discernment. Opportunities that used to feel out of reach now pursue you instead, because they match the blueprint you carry. The environment reflects the shift. You walk into rooms where your strengths are welcomed, not tolerated. And the energy that once exhausted you now returns multiplied. What used to feel threatening now feels distant. The one who tried to tarnish your name can't reach the places you've entered. Their version of you doesn't survive at this altitude. You see them clearly now, not as a villain, but as someone stuck playing an outdated role in a play you've already left. Even their attempts to distort your image seem more like echoes than attacks. They've become background noise in a world where you've become the signal. And without effort, your new alignment begins to speak louder than any announcement. Your life becomes its own confirmation. You don't need to explain your glow. It's visible. You don't have to defend your peace. It's undeniable. While they scramble to curate moments that feel real, you simply live them. And the contrast between forced applause and organic radiance becomes a testimony you never had to write. Some people only learn to cherish what they had once it's completely out of reach. The attempts to pull you back come dressed in sudden awakenings, apologies rehearsed too perfectly, and declarations of change that feel oddly convenient. They swear they see your worth now. They claim they're ready to meet you where you've always stood. But what they chase no longer exists. That version of you, The one willing to overlook their limitations just to feel chosen is long gone. In its place stands someone who's tasted peace and can't unlearn the flavor. What's unfolding isn't drama, it's balance. Every word unspoken, every action dismissed, every energy exchanged without reciprocity now echoes back to its source with remarkable accuracy. The scales aren't being tipped by anger, but by design. What seemed unfair in one season now reveals itself as necessary groundwork. The very structures that once tried to contain you now bend under the weight of their own imbalance. What was taken without gratitude finds its way out of their grasp. What was overlooked becomes unavailable. There's something quietly sacred about realizing the setbacks were actually redirections. The individuals who misread your stillness as weakness unknowingly pushed you into the most aligned version of your life. They were never meant to carry your story forward, only to shake it enough for you to take authorship. The spaces that felt like rejection now look more like divine refusals. Not because you weren't worthy, but because your worth demanded more room than they were capable of holding. And now, from the sidelines, stories begin to surface. Messages from people you barely expected to remember you arrive like unexpected affirmations. They speak of tensions rising where you once brought calm, of ideas running dry where your mind once flowed freely. You hadn't noticed your own ripple until they described the emptiness that followed. What you did naturally, without needing credit, is now missed so deeply it becomes data. The numbers, the outcomes, the mood shifts, they all trace back to your exit. And this time, no one can argue with the evidence. Even in personal circles, the shift becomes undeniable. Attempts to casually mention your name start feeling like poorly veiled inquiries. The same people who once ignored your presence now fish for fragments of your current life through indirect questioning. Others begin to catch on. The tone feels off. The curiosity seems rehearsed. And slowly, the illusion of sincerity collapses. What remains is a pattern of obsession disguised as conversation, and even those closest to them start pulling away from the performance. In the end, your name travels not through rumor, but through resonance. Not because you tried to make a point, but because your absence has become one. They remember you not for the version they tried to control, but for the transformation they never saw coming. And now, without access to you, they are left with only their reflections. And those reflections reveal more about what they lost than what they ever understood. Some patterns become too loud to ignore, even for those who once gave the benefit of the doubt. Whispers begin to circulate among your old social circle, not because of gossip, but because fatigue has set in. People who once played the role of passive listeners start noticing they're being placed in strange positions. Pressured for updates, baited with loaded questions, drawn into conversations that seem harmless at first but always tilt toward the same unspoken goal: information. At first, it passes unnoticed. A comment here, a casual inquiry there. But over time, the design starts to reveal itself. The same people are being asked the same things, often in strangely rehearsed ways. When they compare stories, inconsistencies start piling up like broken glass underfoot. Details that once seemed innocent now look rehearsed. Whole versions of the past shift depending on who's in the room. The storyline no longer holds its shape. What once appeared to be harmless curiosity starts feeling like surveillance. The emotional tone behind it becomes clearer. This isn't someone seeking closure, it's someone unable to release control. And those being used as proxy messengers begin to feel the weight of manipulation. Conversations that once felt warm now carry the awkward tension of someone else's unresolved obsession. Eventually, the spell breaks. People begin pulling back, not out of loyalty to you, but out of discomfort with being cast in a role they never agreed to play. The more they withdraw, the more visible the pattern becomes. What your ex tried to hide behind charm and vague concern now stands fully exposed as strategic interference. The strategy collapses when the audience stops participating. And with that collapse comes a shift in perception. The version of the story they tried to control starts unraveling, not because anyone confronts it directly, but because the truth simply outlasts the performance. The more they talk, the less they're believed. The more they reach, the more others pull away. And what's left is a narrative that no longer bends in their favor, only a spotlight they didn't intend to stand under.